All right, welcome to another deep dive. And today we're going deep on a figure who, I gotta admit, was new to me, Emily Elizabeth Constance Jones. But as I've been reading up on her for this, I'm kind of blown away that, why isn't she more well known in the history of, analytic philosophy especially?
Yeah, she's one of those figures, right, that was very well respected in her time, but kind of has faded a bit from, contemporary philosophical discussions.
Yeah, but it seems like a real shame from what I've been learning.
Yeah.
So for this deep dive, we're going to be diving deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Emily Elizabeth Constance Jones. And our kind of mission for this deep dive is to understand what her core contributions were specifically to philosophical logic and ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, why should our listener, who, is a philosopher themselves, care about this? Why is she someone interesting?
Yeah, well, she was a contemporary of, big names like Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore. So she's operating within this, really exciting period in the development of, analytic philosophy in Cambridge.
Cool. So let's start, biographically. Who was she and kind of, what was her training?
So she was born in Wales in 1848. She eventually, after some delays in her education, matriculated at Girton College, Cambridge in 1875. And for context, Girton was a newly established women's college. There she studied moral sciences trepos under, some really important figures like Henry Sidgwick, who we should note considered her a star student alongside, James Ward and John Neville Keynes.
Cool. And actually the entry even mentions that she got, I think they said first class on her exams.
That's right. Yeah, so really showing her intellectual capabilities. What's interesting too is that her education was actually delayed because her brother's education took precedence.
Wow. Yeah, it's kind of sad to think about how different things were back then.
Yeah, absolutely. She also had a pretty strong linguistic ability. Beyond English, she knew German and French. And this is notable because she actually helped translate Hermann Lotz's Microcosmos after Elizabeth Hamilton died.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Now, another interesting fact about her that kind of sets the stage for her intellectual work is her connection with Sidgwick. So she actually ended up being his literary executor after he died.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty big responsibility.
Yeah, definitely. So it really shows the kind of respect he had for her and her abilities. Now, it was actually in 1884 as a resident lecturer at Girton College where her research in philosophical logic really starts to take off.
Right. And she eventually rose through the ranks at Girton. She became vice mistress and then mistress, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
And she even wrote some introductory logic texts. And, texts on ethics, too.
Yeah, that's right. She was involved in, writing some of the early textbooks on these topics, making them kind of more accessible to students.
Yeah.
And we should also mention that as Mistress of Girton, she actually successfully managed their finances and eliminated a huge debt that they were dealing with.
Oh, wow. So she wasn't just a great logician. She was also a really good administrator.
Exactly. A true polymath.
Yeah. And actually, her death in 1922 was marked by pretty substantial obituaries in major philosophy journals, like Mind, which, again, just emphasizes how important a figure she was in her time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get into her philosophy. What is she really known for? What were kind of her core ideas?
So arguably her most significant contribution to logic is what she called the law of significant assertion. And this arose out of a kind of early fascination she had with the nature and structure of statements.
Right. The entry even mentions that she was kind of puzzled by some of the earlier accounts of propositions that were given by Mill and Jevons. And that kind of got her thinking about what is a proposition and what does it mean for it to be meaningful or significant?
That's right. And a really key piece of this is that she was really interested in the whole paradox of predication.
Right. Which, as I was reading, it's this ancient problem in philosophy. You can even trace it back to Plato.
Right.
But it's the basic issue of how do you say something about something else in a way that's not either completely trivial or a contradiction?
Yeah, exactly. And the figure who really kind of shaped her thinking on this was Hermann Lotz.
Right. Now, Lotze had some pretty radical views on this problem.
He did, yeah. So Lotze argued that when we make a standard predicative statement, the classic S is P kind of form, we run into this problem where either we end up saying something basically S is S, which is just a tautology.
Right, it's just saying something is identical to itself.
Yeah, exactly. Or we end up with a contradiction, S is not S. So He thought that the is of predication, the copula, that should just be thrown out altogether.
Wow.
Yeah. And he thought, the most basic forms of assertion should really just be like identities or negations.
Right. So everything's either A is A or A is not A.
Exactly. But of course, this raises, a huge problem. Like, how do we actually account for statements that seem to convey like new information, new knowledge, if everything just boils down to these like trivial identities or negations?
Right. Because if everything is just like this thing is itself, how are we actually learning anything new about the world?
Yeah, exactly. And Lotz kind of hinted at a way out of this through like focusing on the pragmatic implications of those seemingly trivial statements, what we intend to convey with them. Now, Jones, interestingly, she actually agreed with Lotze on that basic logical form. So she thought, yeah, an affirmative proposition S is P, that is like fundamentally asserting an identity. And it's true if and only if the extension of S, the subject term, is the same as the extension of the predicate term.
So like if the set of things that fall under S is the same set of things that fall under P, then the statement is true.
Right. But here's the crucial part, right? She didn't stop there. She adds this really important element into the picture, which is intentional content. So she's taking Lotz's like purely extensional logical framework and she's adding this intentional element to it. And this allows her to avoid Lotz's conclusion that all affirmative assertion is like inherently trivial.
Okay, so this is where we get to her law of significant assertion.
Exactly. So her law states, any subject of predication is an identity of denotation in diversity of intention.
Okay, that's a mouthful. Break that down for me. What is she saying here?
All right, so the basic idea is this. When we predicate something of, let's say, an object X, we are like identifying X through a specific intention. You can think of this as like the way we conceive of X or the description we have in mind for X. Let's just call this intention F.
Okay.
Then we assert that X, which is identified through this intention F, is, in its denotation, identical to some Y that's identified through a different intention. Let's call that one G.
Okay, so denotation here just means like the actual thing in the world that the term refers to.
Exactly. So what she's saying is that you have this denotational oneness, right? They're referring to the same thing in the world, but there's a diversity of intention. We're coming at that same thing from different like conceptual angles or through different descriptions.
So like two different ways of pointing to the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And this is actually really similar to some later ideas in philosophy of language that, become very famous.
Right, like Frege's distinction between sense and reference.
Exactly.
Or even Russell's earlier, like pre-on denoting distinction between meaning and denotation.
Yeah, so she's wrestling with the same basic problem that those later figures are going to grapple with, which is, how can statements of identity, like the classic example is Hesperus is phosphorus.
Right.
How can those be informative if they're basically just saying an object is identical to itself?
Right. Because on the surface, it's like, well, of course Hesperus is Hesperus. Like,
Yeah.
What's the big deal?
Yeah, so her solution, much like Frege and Russell, involves bringing in this extra level of like meaning or conceptual content that goes beyond just the bearer object itself.
Right. So it's not just about what you're referring to, but also how you're referring to.
Yeah. Now, Jones also had some pretty unique views on the structure of logical forms.
Right. Like she had a kind of different way of like breaking down the parts of a proposition.
Yeah. So, for example, she thought that like in a universal affirmative proposition, like all F is G, the terms of that proposition are the entire quantifier phrase, all F, and then the predicate G.
Okay, so not just F and G, but the whole phrase all F.
Right. Which is a bit different from the more like standard analysis where you'd treat, the subject term F as a separate component.
Right.
And she also thought that there were only two basic kinds of logical forms: identities and their negations.
Okay, so everything ultimately boils down to identity and difference.
Yeah.
And how does this whole law of significant assertion apply to negative statements? Like, what about S is not P?
So she thought that S is not P asserts a difference of denotation, right? The things they refer to are different. But crucially, this difference occurs against a backdrop of like intentional diversity. So the ways we conceive of S and P are different. But there's an interesting criticism that gets raised in the entry by Augusta Klein.
Okay.
Klein argued that for a negative statement to be truly informative, you need something more than just that intentional diversity.
Right, because if I say like horses are not horses, that's technically a difference of denotation
Yeah.
and a diversity of intention, if we're using Jones's framework.
Mm.
But it's not really telling us anything new.
Exactly. So Klein suggested that, for it to be actually informative, the intentions themselves have to share some common ground, some significant overlap.
Right. So like horses are not houseplants is informative.
Yeah.
Because horses and houseplants share some conceptual space, even though they ultimately refer to different things.
Right. Okay, so going back to Jones's law of significant assertion, she saw this as a way to, solve the problem of how predication can be informative, even if we understand it as a kind of identity.
Right. Because, if S is P ultimately just means S is S,
Yeah.
how are we learning anything new by saying that?
Yeah. So she brings in this diversity of intention to explain how we can have, genuine knowledge gain through predication.
Okay. Now, one thing that I was wondering about as I was reading this was she calls it a new law of thought. But, how does this fit in with the more traditional laws of thought, like the laws of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle?
Yeah, that's a good point. So in the 19th century, those were generally seen as, the fundamental principles of logic.
Right, right.
And Jones wasn't trying to add to those or replace them. She wasn't saying, here's a fourth law of thought.
Okay.
She saw her law as more of a prior principle.
Okay. What does that mean?
So her idea was that if you just start with the law of identity, A is A, it's hard to see how you get to meaningful assertions of the S is P form, the kind of assertions that actually give us new knowledge.
Right. If you just start with this thing is itself, how do you get to this thing is also this other thing?
Yeah. So she thought that to even apply the laws of non-contradiction and excluded middle, you need to have propositions of the S is P form and S is not P form that actually have content.
Right. So to say A cannot be both B and not B, you first need to have some idea of what it means for A to be B and what it means for A to not be B.
Exactly. So her law was meant to explain how you get those meaningful S is P propositions in the first place. It's like a necessary foundation for those other laws of thought to operate on.
Okay, so it's not a new law within the system of logic, but more like a condition for the system of logic to work in the first place.
Right. It's a constraint on what counts as a significant assertion.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, apart from this law, Jones also had some interesting things to say of the relationship between intention and extension.
Yeah. And what's really striking is how much she anticipated some later ideas that become really influential in philosophy of language.
Right.
So she clearly recognized that grasping the intention of a term, its conceptual content, its meaning,
right,
is neither necessary nor sufficient for grasping its extension, the set of things it refers to in the world, and vice versa.
Okay. Can you give me some examples of how she illustrated that?
Yeah, so she pointed out that you could have a pretty good grasp of the extension of, say, the term metal. Gold's a metal, silver's a metal, copper's a metal.
Right.
But you might not be able to give a precise, universally agreed upon definition of what a metal is.
Right. So you might be able to pick out metals in the world, but you might not be able to articulate the essential properties that make something a metal.
Exactly. And conversely, you might, know everyone in your village by name. You know who everyone is.
Right.
But you might not be able to give a, detailed description of every single person.
Right. So you've got the extension, you know who they are, but you might not have a clear intention for each person.
Exactly. And this really anticipates, later work on proper names and the idea that, proper names don't necessarily get their meaning from a, uniquely identifying description.
Right. You can know who someone is without knowing a bunch of facts about them.
Exactly. And she even gave examples being able to tell a real diamond from a fake diamond.
Right.
Even if you don't have the scientific knowledge to say exactly what makes a diamond.
Right. So you're working with the extension, you can tell them apart,
yeah,
but you might not have a clear grasp of the intention.
Yeah. And while she didn't fully develop all the implications of this the way, later philosophers like Kripke and Putnam did, it's still pretty remarkable how much she was already thinking along these lines.
Right. So she's really ahead of her time in some of these insights about how reference works.
Absolutely. No, she did think there was a connection between intention and extension.
Okay.
She suggested that you could often reconstruct the intention of a term by looking at its extension.
Right. So by seeing what things the term applies to, you might be able to figure out what the concept is.
Yeah. But she wasn't saying, like, you can always do this or that this is the only way to get to the intention.
Right.
It was more like a practical observation that in a lot of cases, you can get clues about the intention by looking at the extension.
Okay, so she's not committed to a strong backward road from extension to intention.
Right. And she also acknowledged that, sometimes you can have the intention without having the extension.
Right.
Like you might have a really detailed description of like a historical figure, but you wouldn't be able to recognize them if you saw them on the street.
Right, you've got the concept, but you can't actually pick out the referent in the world.
Yeah. And she pointed out that this shows that, like, recognition, the ability to actually pick out the referent, isn't just about having a description, it's something more than that.
Right, so it's not just about, like, matching a concept to an object. There's something else going on there.
Yeah, exactly. And these points are really prominent in her early work, which suggests they were, like, really central to her whole philosophical project, even if she didn't, like, fully spell out all the implications.
Right, right. Okay, so let's look at how she applied this idea that, like, all affirmative propositions are ultimately identities. The entry uses the example. This small, fragrant wildflower is clematis.
Yeah. So her analysis of that would be that in that particular context, both this small, fragrant wildflower and clematis refer to the same thing.
Right, like they have the same extension.
Yeah. But the way we're conceiving of that thing is different.
Right, the intention is different.
Yeah. One is like a description based on what we observe. The other is like a name.
Right.
And she also adopted this kind of unusual view from William Hamilton, where she thought that predicate terms are implicitly quantified.
Okay.
So like a statement like, all humans are mortal. She would read that as, all humans are some mortals.
Okay. Why did she think that?
Well, it was really important for her view that significant assertion is all about identity.
Okay.
Because if all humans are mortal just meant that the set of all humans is identical to the set of all mortals,
Right.
then it would follow that all mortals are humans, which is obviously not right.
Right. Because identity is symmetrical.
Yeah, so by adding that implicit quantification, she gets around that problem.
Okay, so all humans are some mortals doesn't imply all mortals are humans.
Exactly. And this also leads to a kind of non-standard view of conversion for her.
Okay.
So the converse of all humans are mortals for her wouldn't be all mortals are humans, it would be some mortals are humans.
Okay.
Which fits with the idea that they're both like fundamentally identity statements, just with the order of the terms flipped.
Right.
Now, the entry mentions an objection that was raised by W.E. Johnson.
Okay.
He argued that her analysis of predication, like breaking it down to identity, actually like presupposes predication.
Okay. How so?
Well, he pointed out that if you analyze Socrates is mortal as Socrates is identical to some mortal,
Right.
the phrase some mortal already involves predication. Like it's referring to the set of things that are mortal.
Right. You're already using the idea of being mortal to define the set.
Yeah. So Johnson's point is that her analysis is kind of circular. It uses the very thing it's trying to explain.
Right, right.
Now, Jones did respond to this, but it shows a kind of fundamental difficulty with trying to reduce predication to just identity.
Right. Okay. So her overall theory of predication might have some problems, but the entry suggests that her insights about like how identity statements can be informative, that's still worth looking at. And it's especially interesting to compare that to Frege and Russell.
Yeah, exactly. Even
Yeah.
if the broader theory has issues, there's still a lot of value in her analysis of identity.
Okay, so let's start with Frege. What's the connection there?
So Frege, in his famous paper on sense and reference, he argues that you can't just have a purely referential theory of meaning.
Right, where the meaning of a word is just the object it refers to.
Yeah, because he says if that's the case, then you can't explain why Hesperus is different from Hesperus is phosphorus.
Right, because if both names just refer to Venus, then both statements are just saying Venus is Venus.
Exactly. And that doesn't capture the fact that one of those is like a trivial tautology and the other is a potentially significant discovery.
Right.
So Frege introduces this distinction between sense and reference.
Right, so the sense is like the way we think about the referent, the concept we have of it,
Yeah,
and the reference is the actual object in the world.
exactly. And this allows him to explain how you can have informative identity statements. Because even if two names have the same reference, they can have different senses.
Right, so Hesperus and Phosphorus both refer to Venus, but they express different ways of thinking about Venus.
Yeah. And Jones, she was also concerned with how assertions can be informative, how they can go beyond just being tautologies.
Right.
And while her framework, with its focus on denotation and intention, isn't as developed as Frige's mature theory, they're both wrestling with the same fundamental issue.
Right. The issue of how identity statements can be meaningful.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is that the entry suggests they might have both been influenced by Lotz.
Oh, okay. So there's a kind of like a shared intellectual lineage there.
Yeah, potentially.
Okay. What about Russell? How does Jones's work compare to his?
So Russell, in his Principles of Mathematics, he talks about denoting concepts,
Right.
which are kind of like Jones's intentions.
Okay.
And he says that, like, you can have informative identity statements when one of the terms is a denoting concept. So, for example, Edward VII is the king.
Right.
That's informative because, like, Edward VII is just a name, but the king is a denoting concept that picks out that specific person. And similarly, like, the present pope is the last survivor of his generation. That's informative because it links two different denoting concepts to the same individual.
Right.
So for Russell, a trivial identity would be like relating a term directly to itself. But when you have these denoting concepts, it becomes more significant. And this is really similar to Jones's idea that, a bare identity is less interesting than an identity that involves different intentions.
Right. So it's not just that two things are the same, but that they're the same in virtue of these different ways of conceiving of them.
Exactly. And both Jones and Russell saw like purely self-referential identities as kind of pointless outside of like formal systems of logic.
Right. Like A is fine for logic, but in real life, we're more interested in like A is B.
Yeah. Now, Russell also applied this to the problem of like vacuous terms, like the present king of France.
Right.
Jones didn't really address that issue.
Sure.
But it shows that Russell was like taking this idea of denoting concepts and pushing it further in certain directions.
Right. So they have this shared interest in like how identity statements can be informative.
Yeah.
But they end up applying it to different kinds of philosophical problems.
Yeah. And it's interesting because given all these similarities, you would think that Russell would have like explicitly acknowledged Jones's work.
Right. Especially because they were both at Cambridge and they had some shared teachers.
Yeah. But there's surprisingly little direct citation of Jones in Russell's work.
Really? That's weird.
Yeah. And the entry mentions this like really revealing letter that Russell wrote to Philip Jourdain in 1909.
Okay.
So Jourdain was writing a book about Frige's logic, and he mentions Jones's distinction between connotation and denotation to Russell.
Okay.
And he's like, hey, how does this relate to Frige's sense and reference and to your own ideas? And Russell basically dismisses it as a commonplace of logic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He says it's not like a big deal. It's just something everyone knows.
But like at that time, those distinctions weren't really commonplace, were they?
No, not really. Frege and Russell were still developing those ideas.
Right.
And the entry points out that this is a pretty uncharitable reading of Jones.
Yeah. Like he's not really doing her a fair shake.
No. And what's even weirder is that John Neville Keynes, who had also been one of Russell's teachers.
Right.
He used an example to illustrate Jones's distinction that's like really similar to Frige's Hesperus phosphorus example.
Oh, okay. So it's like Russell recognizes the importance of that distinction when Frege makes it, but not when Jones makes it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so strange.
It is. So why is Russell so dismissive of Jones?
Yeah, like what's going on there?
Well, the entry speculates on a few possibilities. One is that like maybe Russell was just resentful of Jourdain.
Okay.
Because Jourdain was like knowledgeable about both the old school logic and the new like mathematical logic that Russell was championing.
Right.
So maybe Russell felt like Jourdain was like downplaying the importance of his and Frige's work by bringing up Jones.
Okay, so it's like a territorial thing.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
Another possibility is that like Russell was just like really invested in this idea that he and Frege were making a radical break with the past.
Right. They were starting a revolution in logic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so acknowledging that Jones, who was working in a more traditional framework, had similar ideas, that would have been kind of awkward for that narrative.
Right. It would make the revolution look less revolutionary.
Yeah. And the entry even mentions that Jones herself, later on, claimed to have been the first to articulate the connotation distinction.
Oh, okay.
Although she didn't say that she had influenced Russell.
Right, right.
So it's a really complex situation.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of like personal and professional stuff mixed in with the philosophical disagreements.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just about the ideas themselves, it's about the whole context in which those ideas were being developed.
Right. Okay, so they didn't always see eye to eye, but they did have a public exchange at one point, right?
They did. So in 1910, Jones published a paper called Categorical Propositions and the Law of Identity, which she later revised and republished as A New Law of Thought and Its Implications. And then in 1911, Russell responded to her in his paper Knowledge by Acquaintance and Knowledge by Description.
Okay.
So even if Russell hadn't explicitly acknowledged Jones's work before, he's clearly engaging with her pretty directly in this paper.
Right.
And the main thing they disagreed about was Russell's example of George V and Waverley.
Right. The one where George V wants to know if Scott is the author of Waverley.
Yeah. So Russell uses this example to argue that definite descriptions, like the author of Waverley, can't just be disguised names.
Okay.
Because if they were, then the question, is Scott the author of Waverley, would just mean, is Scott Scott?
Right. Which is a trivial question.
Yeah. And Russell's point is that George V wasn't asking a trivial question. He was genuinely curious about something.
Right.
Now, Jones's take on this is that what George V wanted to know was whether the intention of the author of Waverley applied to Scott.
Okay.
So it's not just about whether they refer to the same person. It's about whether Scott has the properties that are associated with being the author of Waverley.
Right.
And Russell's response is basically to double down on his distinction between descriptions and names.
Okay.
He says that a name is just a label. It doesn't tell you anything about the person.
Okay.
But a description, like the author of Waverley, that has meaning beyond just referring to a specific person.
Right. Because it's built up out of words that have their own meanings.
Exactly. And the connection between that description and Scott isn't just arbitrary. It depends on the fact that Scott actually wrote the book.
Okay.
And then Russell brings up his regress argument.
Right. The one where he says that descriptions don't have meaning in isolation.
Yeah. So he says if Scott is the author of Waverley, it means something like Scott is the denotation of the meaning of the author of Waverley.
Okay.
Then you have this infinite regress.
Right. Because then you have to explain the meaning of the author of Waverley and so on. Okay. And how does Jones respond to that?
Well, she basically says that explaining one proposition with another proposition of the same form, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Okay.
And she later elaborates on this in response to C.D. Broad. She says that you could generate a similar kind of regress.